Associate Dean here for Public Affairs and Communications, and I'm pleased to welcome you today on this beautiful day, so we appreciate you being here, to a discussion titled Hashtag Full Equality, a Women's Economic Agenda with Nancy Duff Campbell, who's the founder and co-president of the National Women's Law Center. Campbell is visiting this year as the Judith H. Rawson and Robert Rawson Distinguished Visitor, and so we're very pleased that Bob Rawson is here to hear the talk and join us afterwards for dinner. And Bob is from the great class of 1966 and is a senior counsel at Jones Day. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Nancy Duff Campbell, or Duffy as she is known, is the founder and co-president of one of the nation's preeminent women's rights organizations, a recognized expert on women's law and public policy issues, and the recipient of numerous awards. Campbell has participated for over 40 years in the development and implementation of key legislative initiatives and litigation protecting women's rights, with a particular emphasis on issues affecting low-income women and their families. And the list of her accomplishments is very long. I encourage you to go online and read them all, so I'll just give you some examples. She's participated in successful U.S. Supreme Court cases. She's advocated in Congress and in administrative agencies for laws and rules protecting women and their families. And she's worked to communicate the importance of policies to ensure that all families, again with particular emphasis on low-income families, are given opportunities to succeed in America. And she's been widely recognized for her work. Just some examples. She was the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for her work to improve child support enforcement. The D.C. William Barr gave her the William J. Brennan Award for exemplary legal career dedicated to service in the public interest. She was named by Working Woman magazine as one of the top 25 heroines whose actions over the last 25 years have advanced women in the workplace. And she was named a Woman of Genius by Trinity Washington University. And in 2010 was named the Woman Lawyer of the Year by the D.C. Women's Bar Association. She's also given some time and wisdom to here at the Woodrow Wilson School. She serves on the advisory board for the school Center for Research on Child Wellbeing. On a totally personal note, she was once my boss. So I worked for Duffy for too short a period. It was only for 4 years, but I count her as a friend and a mentor, and so I'm so pleased you're here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and I'll definitely say that our loss of Elizabeth has definitely been Princeton's gain. And she mentioned the award for child support. That was what Elizabeth worked on when she was at the center, and much of her work, so I credit her with my receiving that award. And thank you to Princeton generally, and to the Woodrow Wilson School in particular, and to Judy and Bob Rawson for helping to fund this incredible program. I'm only a day and a half in, and it's just been amazing. I've met amazing students and had great conversations, so I'm looking forward to more of that before tomorrow when I have to leave. And I also want to thank my colleagues at the National Women's Law Center because much of my talk today is based on the report that's on the screen here that we did on why the country needs a women's economic agenda and what should be the components of that agenda. And I'm not able to talk about everything that's in the report today, but I commend it to you for reading, for putting you to sleep at night whenever you need something like that. In the last 4 decades, the educational levels and work experience of women have increased dramatically. I think most of us know that. But although women have better education than ever before, and they are typically still paid less than men, and they are more likely than men to work in minimum wage and low-wage jobs. They also often lack the important supports they need to succeed in the workplace, such as affordable and high-quality childcare, and they are more likely than men to live in poverty. A women's economic agenda to address these and other barriers to women's advancement is essential, not only for women's full equality, but also for their ability to care for and support their families, and we believe for the advancement of the nation as a whole. Women increased their educational attainment in the 1970s and 1980s, and today more women than men graduate college. Women also increased their share of the labor force during this period, from 38% in 1970 to nearly 47% today. The importance of women's income to their families has also grown, and their importance of their income to the U.S. economy has increased over the last 40 years. For example, the share of mothers who are sole breadwinners or co-breadwinners increased from about 27% in 1967 to over 63% today. In fact, most of the growth in family income in the last several decades has been the result of women's increased earnings. As the Council of Economic Advisors has observed, without the gains women have made since 1970, our overall economy would be $2 trillion smaller. Now, despite the importance of women's earnings to family income and to the economy, women who work full-time, year-round, are typically paid only 79 cents for every dollar paid to their male counterparts, up from 78 cents last year. And I'll just say that these slides are ones that we use at the National Women's Law Center to push out some of our data, and we try to make them funny when we can. For African American women and Latinas, the gap is even larger. They're paid only 60 cents and 55 cents, respectively, for every dollar earned by white non-Latino men. The pay gap between women and men exists in nearly every occupation, across all educational levels, and affects women at all income levels. Job segregation and the fact that female-dominated jobs typically pay less than male-dominated jobs contribute to the pay gap. But even when women are working at the same jobs as men, they are often paid less. Sex stereotyping and other forms of discrimination contribute to the pay gap. For example, employers sometimes perceive women as not tough enough for some jobs, or not needing raises or promotions because they aren't breadwinners, or less committed to their jobs than men, usually because of women's caregiving responsibilities. Sexual harassment is a continuing, persistent problem too, particularly among low-wage workers. Women's concentration in minimum wage jobs contributes to the pay gap and to their economic insecurity. Because the federal minimum wage is set by Congress, its value remains the same unless Congress acts, and its purchasing power erodes as the cost of living increases. Congress has raised the federal minimum wage only 3 times in the last 30 years, and it's currently just $7.25 an hour. But women are 2/3 of minimum wage workers. A woman working full-time, year-round at the federal minimum wage earns just $14,500 a year, more than $4,500 below the poverty line for a mother with 2 children. There's a separate federal minimum wage for tip workers, and it's currently just $2.13 an hour, less than 1/3 of the federal minimum wage. Congress has not raised the federal tip minimum wage in nearly 25 years. Women are 2/3 of workers in tipped occupations, and this too contributes to the pay gap. Women's concentration in all low-wage jobs, defined here as those that pay under $10.50 an hour, is also high. Women are 2/3 of these workers. They work in jobs such as home health aides, childcare workers, fast food workers, retail clerks, restaurant servers, and maids and housekeeping cleaners. Now, what some of us typically think of as a low-wage worker is someone young, just starting out in work or perhaps working part-time while in school. But low-wage women workers don't fit this profile. Only 11% are teenagers, and more than 1/4 are age 50 and older. 4 out of 5 women in low-wage jobs have a high school education or higher. In fact, more than 4 in 10 have college or higher. 3 in 10 are mothers, and nearly 40% of these mothers have family incomes below $25,000. Nearly half of mothers of children under 18 in the low-wage workforce are single. More generally, most women in the low-wage workforce do not have a spouse's income to rely on. Nearly 2/3 are single. Women's shares of the low-wage workforce are larger than men's, even though women's shares of the overall workforce are almost always similar to or smaller than men's shares of the overall workforce. In fact, regardless of educational level, age, marital or parental status, race, ethnicity, or national origin, women make up larger shares of the low-wage workforce than men. The only group of women that is underrepresented in the low-wage workforce are women with a bachelor's degree. Now you're all glad you're here at Princeton. They are 18% of the overall workforce, but only 6% of the low-wage workforce. But their representation in the low-wage workforce is still higher than men's. Men with a bachelor's degree are also 18% of the overall workforce, but only 4% of the low-wage workforce. In short, women need a bachelor's degree to avoid being overrepresented in the low-wage workforce, while men only need to finish high school. Even in these low-wage jobs, women working full-time year-round face a 15% wage gap, and the gap is even larger for African-American women and Latinas. More than 1 in 6 women in low-wage jobs is poor, and nearly 1 in 3 lives in a family with an annual income of less than $25,000. In addition to the challenges of unequal pay and low wages, women are the principal caregivers in most families. They are often responsible not only for children, but also for older individuals and individuals with disabilities, including adult children, spouses, siblings, and other family members. And many women don't have a partner or other adult who can share these responsibilities. In order to participate in the workforce at all, they need child and other dependent care. But many families struggle to afford this care. The average fee for full-time child care ranges from over $4,000 to over $16,500 a year, depending on where a family lives, the type of care, and the age of the child. Low-income families particularly struggle to afford the safe and stable child care they need to be able to work, much less the high-quality care their children need to be successful in school. More than 1 in 6 employed mothers of very young children, ages 3 and under, works in a low-wage job. And finding and affording care for infants and toddlers is particularly difficult. But only 1 in 6 eligible children qualifies for federal child care assistance, and state funding has not made up the difference. Indeed, today, 21 states have waiting lists for child care assistance or have frozen intake for such assistance because of inadequate funds. Although several states and cities have initiated programs to expand access to preschool, and the federal Head Start program has provided early learning opportunities for many low-income children, many families do not have access to preschool either. Only 52% of 3- and 4-year-old children are enrolled in public or private preschool programs. Low-income children, once again, are less likely to be enrolled than higher-income children. These gaps mean that children don't have the early learning experiences that are critical to their development and future success in school, and that parents don't have the stable arrangements that are critical to their success in work and beyond. Even workers with stable childcare arrangements may need to take time off from work because of a family illness or injury, or more happily, because of the addition of a child to a family by birth or adoption. But few workers have paid family leave, and many don't even have paid sick days. Only 13% of workers have access to paid family leave, and only 65% of workers even have paid sick days through their employers. Fewer than 40% of workers have access to paid medical leave through employer-provided short-term disability insurance. The numbers are even starker for low-wage workers. Of workers in occupations in the bottom 10% of wages, only 22% have access to paid sick days, and a paltry 4% have access to paid family leave. The Family and Medical Leave Act provides important job protection for workers who take time away from work to address a serious health condition, care for a family member with a serious health condition, or care for a newborn or newly adopted child. But because it only covers employers with at least 50 employees, and only employees who have had a required number of work hours with the same employer, fewer than 60% of workers are covered by its provisions. In addition, because it only guarantees unpaid leave, many workers who are covered by it can't afford to take advantage of it. For these workers, just taking a day off because a child is ill can end up costing a day's pay, and a need to take maternity leave can end up costing their job. It's startling that the United States is one of only 2 of 188 countries that does not guarantee paid parental leave to new mothers. It's one of only 2 of the 15 most highly competitive countries that does not guarantee paid parental leave to new fathers. Equally startling, the United States is the only highly competitive country that does not guarantee paid medical leave for serious illnesses. Other working conditions in some jobs often make meeting family responsibilities difficult also. Low-wage jobs in particular often have unpredictable schedules over which workers have little or no control. Many workers in low-wage jobs experience unstable schedules with hours that vary from week to week or month to month, or periodic reductions in work hours when work is slow, leading to major fluctuations in their income that puts workers and their families in financial jeopardy. Increasingly, employers, especially in restaurant and retail work, are using sophisticated computer technology to determine when they need workers and when they don't. Employers using this technology often have so-called just-in-time schedules, which involve giving workers their schedules with very little notice to try to match labor costs to consumer demands. Or they may send workers home during lag times, or require them to work split shifts, where they work for a few hours, are off for a few hours, and then work for a few hours more. The workers receive no payment for the time in between, and they have no ability to do anything else during this time that might produce income. These kinds of jobs also often require working nights and weekends or even overnight, or offer only part-time work, despite many workers' need for full-time hours. These kinds of work schedules have a cascading effect also on their families as well. They result in variable and uncertain income, yet their unpredictability makes it difficult for a worker to take a second job or to participate in an education or training program that might advance the worker's skills. Make it extremely difficult to arrange childcare, especially on nights and weekends. And they put severe strains on family and other relationships. Some women also face discrimination explicitly because of their caregiving responsibilities. One study found that employers recommended mothers for hire less often, recommended lower starting salaries for them, and rated them less competent than non-mothers with nearly identical resumes. In contrast, employers rated fathers for hire more often, regarded them as more competent, and recommended them for higher salaries than non-fathers. Motherhood also accounts for a large proportion of the pay gap between women and men. Among full-time year-round workers, mothers typically earn only 70 cents for every dollar paid to men, compared to the 79 cents women overall typically earn for every dollar paid to men. Although largely outlawed by the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, women continue to face employment discrimination on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. Between 1997 and 2011, for example, the number of pregnancy discrimination charges filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and parallel state and local agencies increased by nearly 50%. Although many women work through their pregnancies without any need for accommodation, some women have a medical need for a temporary adjustment to their work schedules or for their job duties. This is especially true for women in jobs that require lifting, long periods of standing, or repetitive motions. However, too often when pregnant women ask for these even modest accommodations, such as an opportunity to sit on a stool or drink water during a long shift, they are instead forced onto unpaid leave or even fired. Although the Pregnancy Discrimination Act requires employers to treat pregnant workers the same as other workers who are not pregnant but are similar in their ability or inability to work, some employers refuse to provide reasonable accommodations for pregnant women, even when they provide accommodations for employees with disabilities that arise out of other conditions. So if you have a bad back, for example, because you played soccer on the weekend, fine, the employer will accommodate you. But if you have a bad back because you're pregnant, no dice. This is particularly a problem for women who work in low-wage jobs, which are often physically demanding. for example, jobs in housekeeping or as nurses' aides, or in the retail and food service industries. Yet these same sectors are often marked by inflexible workplace cultures in which employers refuse to make accommodations. A recent survey estimated that more than 250,000 pregnant workers are denied their requests for reasonable accommodations nationally every year. Many women workers also don't have affordable employer-provided health care that meets their needs, including their needs for reproductive health care. For example, only 33% of firms with large shares of low-wage workers offer health benefits to their employees. The Affordable Care Act both expands access to health care and corrects many of the long-standing gender inequities in the U.S. health insurance market, including by requiring health plans to cover maternity care, by providing coverage for preventive services that are particularly important to women, and by ending gender rating and other insurance practices in the individual and small group market that have limited women's access to health insurance. But there are gaps in the Affordable Care Act's reproductive health coverage and in its coverage of family members. In addition, the refusal of 20 states to adopt the Medicaid expansion that was authorized by the Affordable Care Act has left approximately 3 million low-income women without health insurance. The United States Supreme Court has twice upheld the Affordable Care Act against challenges brought to undo it or its central provisions. But in Burwell v. Hobby Lobby, it ruled that under the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, closely held for-profit companies whose owners have religious objections can refuse to comply with the ACA's requirement that all FDA-approved methods of birth control be covered by insurance without a copay. Without insurance coverage, women may not be able to afford the birth control they need. The cost of an IUD, for example, can be as much as a full month's pay for a minimum wage worker. Following the decision in Hobby Lobby, the Obama administration issued guidance on how to accommodate closely held corporations whose owners have religious objections to contraception, as well as religiously affiliated institutions with similar objections, and still ensure that women receive contraceptive coverage. It essentially requires the entity that objects to providing contraceptive services to notify either the insurance company or the federal government of its objection, whereupon the insurer will provide the coverage directly to the individual woman. But even this has been challenged in the courts as imposing a substantial burden on religion. And there's now a split in the federal judicial circuits that have addressed the issue, which may mean that the Supreme Court will revisit it this term. Across the country, women have also been punished or fired by their employers for using birth control or for undergoing in vitro sterilization, in vitro fertilization in order to get pregnant, or for having sex without being married. Again, often because the employers have religious objections to these practices. Failing to provide women with the ability to control and space pregnancy or punishing them when they do become pregnant not only jeopardizes their ability to advance their education and their employment, but also could result in an increased need for abortion services. But these services too have become harder to obtain and pay for because of restrictive federal and state laws. In the past 5 years alone, state legislatures have passed 282 laws restricting abortion. In addition to making it difficult to get an abortion, these laws are designed to test current Supreme Court precedents, and one or more of these cases may be heard by the Supreme Court this term, potentially jeopardizing even Roe v. Wade. Because for women, it takes a bachelor's degree to avoid overrepresentation in low-wage jobs, expanding women's access both to college and to higher-paying jobs that are non-traditional for women is also important. As this audience knows well, the rising cost of college education, coupled with the recent recession, has meant that post-secondary education is out of reach for many students unless they rely on student loans. This can in turn mean taking on massive amounts of debt and devoting high percentages of later earnings to loan repayments. One study found that among full-time workers repaying their loans 1 year after college graduation, almost 50% of women and 40% of men were paying more than 8% of their earnings towards student loan debt. Student parents face particular educational barriers. One study found that nearly half of student parents work full-time while enrolled in college. In addition to shouldering caregiving responsibilities, which are typically heavier for mothers than for fathers, student parents often have difficulty finding affordable, good quality childcare. Yet few college campuses provide on-site childcare. And student parents may also not be able to receive financial assistance to help pay for off-campus childcare because states set limits on childcare assistance for parents in college or don't provide any assistance for parents who are pursuing four-year degrees. Sexual harassment and sexual assault on college campuses also threatens women's educational success. The emotional and physical effects of sexual harassment and violence can be devastating, leading students to drop out of school altogether in many instances. Despite Title IX's prohibition on sex discrimination, federally funded education programs, too many schools have been slow to recognize their obligation to respond to and prevent sexual harassment and assault. Women also remain underrepresented in education and training programs that provide pathways to higher paying jobs. These many barriers to women's economic security continue to affect them as they age. Women's lower lifetime earnings and longer lifespans than men mean they have fewer resources to rely on as they age and are more likely than men to spend years alone without the support of a spouse. Defined benefit pensions are disappearing, and more than half of all seniors have no savings in retirement accounts. Only 18% of private sector workers have access to a defined benefit pension, and 40% of families headed by near retirement age individuals ages 55 to 64, have no retirement savings. When all families are considered, even those who have retirement accounts, the median account balance for near retirement age individuals is $12,000. Low-wage workers are even less likely than other workers to participate in a retirement plan at work. Among women ages 21 to 64 earning less than $10,000 a year, fewer than 10% participate in an employer-offered plan. Among women earning between $10,000 and $20,000, only 20% participate. In addition, many women work part-time, but even employers who offer retirement plans are not required to offer them to part-time employees. Just 24% of part-time, year-round women workers participate in an employer-offered plan. It's therefore no surprise that women are more dependent on Social Security than men, although their benefits are typically lower. The average Social Security benefit for individuals ages 65 and older is about $18,000 a year for men, but only $13,900 for women. Yet on average, women beneficiaries receive 61% of their family income from Social Security, compared to 56% for men. Indeed, Social Security provides 90% or more of income for 30% of women beneficiaries, compared to 23% of male beneficiaries. And the percentages are even higher for African American women and Latinas. Although federal law prohibits discrimination in employment, housing, and education, it does not, sex discrimination, it does not specifically prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. It also does not prohibit discrimination in public accommodations on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, or sex for that matter. And although some administrative and court interpretations have taken the position that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity is prohibited sex discrimination because it is based on similar gender stereotyping, several courts have disagreed with this interpretation. Since the Supreme Court's decision earlier this year striking down restrictions on same-sex marriage, the need for broader protection against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity has been given new impetus, and legislation has been introduced in Congress that would provide this protection. The lack of this protection received increased attention last spring when individuals and businesses asserted a right to rely on state religious freedom laws, like the federal law that was involved in the Hobby Lobby case that involved contraception. They were relying on these laws to justify actions that discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Widespread criticism of Indiana's religious freedom law, for example, led to changes in the law. But those changes did not expressly prohibit LGBTQ discrimination. They only removed reliance on the state religious freedom law as an authorized justification for such discrimination or as a defense to it. Discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity inflicts specific harm on women. Nationwide, a higher percentage of lesbians live in poverty than straight women, straight men, or gay men. Among those under age 50, lesbians and bisexual and transgender women are far more likely than gay, bisexual, and transgender men to be raising children, 48% compared to 20%. And LGBT parents are more likely than heterosexual parents to live in poverty. These barriers to women's economic advancement and security have real consequences. The median income of women working full-time year-round is approximately $39,600 compared to $50,400 for their male counterparts. The median income of African American women and Latinas is even lower, approximately $35,400 and $30,800 respectively. These disparities especially hurt women and families who rely on women's earnings for much of their income, as more and more families do. They also contribute to poverty rates for women that are substantially above the poverty rates for men. Poverty rate for women is nearly 15% compared to 11% for men. And for families with children headed by a woman only, it is nearly 40% compared to 22% for families with children headed by a man only, and 8% for families with children headed by a married couple. More than half of all poor children live in families headed by a woman only. Even with Social Security, more than 12% of women ages 65 and older live in poverty, compared to 7% of their male counterparts. The poverty rate for women ages 65 and older living alone is nearly 20%, compared to 12% for their male counterparts. And more than 2/3 of the poor ages 65 and older are women. These are all the reasons we need a women's economic agenda. And in fact, recognizing that when women succeed, their families and the nation as a whole prospers, legislators, executives, and political candidates at both the federal and state levels are proposing and implementing measures to address the economic challenges facing women and their families. Anne Marie Slaughter's Unfinished Business is just one of several recent books about the economic challenges facing women and the ways to address them. And with polls showing the popularity of measures that are designed to increase economic security, especially among women voters, these measures have a particular saliency as we head into a presidential election year. There are many measures that could and should be part of a women's economic agenda. My intent is not to provide an exhaustive catalog of these components, but rather to highlight some key components of such an agenda at the federal level that are both currently under consideration and potentially achievable. These are incremental measures, to be sure, which is why they should be achievable, but their adoption would particularly help low-income women and their families. All of these are measures that the National Women's Law Center has helped to develop and is working to achieve. It's a women's economic agenda, but its provision will help men, especially men who are low-wage workers. Although largely beyond the scope of this presentation, it's important to acknowledge that states have taken the lead on many of these issues. In many instances, there are analogous measures that either have been or could be introduced at the state or local level that are similar to the ones that I'm about to describe. These too are measures that the National Women's Law Center is helping to advance. Indeed, unfortunately, at least in the short run, there may be more possibility of success in achieving some of these at the state and local level than at the federal level. Although the National Women's Law Center report that I referenced at the beginning of this presentation includes discussion of solutions, proposed solutions to all of the issues that I've addressed, I'm only going to address a few today in the interest of time. First, we need to strengthen the protections that we have against pay discrimination. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 requires that women and men who are performing essentially the same jobs be paid equally. And Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits sex discrimination in employment. These and other laws, to be sure, have helped reduce pay discrimination. But court decisions have created loopholes in the protections offered by the Equal Pay Act and Title VII, and in several instances, these laws provide incomplete remedies. In addition, too often employees are in the dark about pay disparities because employers have policies that prohibit employees from voluntarily sharing salary information with their coworkers. The proposed Paycheck Fairness Act would strengthen the Equal Pay Act in a number of ways by making it easier to identify and remedy discrimination in pay, and by closing loopholes in the law and providing incentives to employers to voluntarily comply with the law. For example, the bill would prohibit retaliation against employees for discussing their pay. It would bring the remedies for equal pay violations in line with those that are currently available for other pay discrimination based on race or ethnicity, by allowing individuals who win equal pay cases to recover compensatory and punitive damages. And it would tighten the defenses that are available to employers who claim a business reason for discriminatory pay. Administrative actions can also help improve efforts to secure equal pay. For example, last year, President Obama issued an executive order prohibiting federal contractors from retaliating against employees who voluntarily discuss their compensation. And he issued a presidential memorandum at the same time that instructed the Secretary of Labor to promulgate new regulations requiring federal contractors to submit summary data on employee compensation, including by race and gender. Both of these measures shine a light on pay discrimination and are encouraging ways of trying to redress it. The Fair Pay Act would go even further, for example, by requiring that female-dominated jobs receive the same pay as male-dominated jobs that require equivalent skill level, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. And the state of California has just passed a similar law that it will be interesting to see how it is implemented. Second, we need to increase the minimum wage. The proposed Raise the Wage Act would increase the federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to $12 an hour by 2020, and then index it to keep pace with wages overall. The bill would also eliminate the federal tipped minimum wage by gradually raising it until it is equal to the regular minimum wage. Other measures that have been introduced in Congress would increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Many states are ahead of the federal government here, too. 29 states and the District of Columbia currently have minimum wages that are above the federal level, including 15 states that index the minimum wage to keep pace with inflation. Over 1/4 of all mothers in the paid labor force with children under 18 would get a raise if the minimum wage were increased to $12 an hour. This increase in the minimum wage would also reduce the pay gap for women. The average pay gap in states with a minimum wage that is at or above $8 an hour, for example, is 22% smaller than the average wage gap in states that have a minimum wage of only $7.25 an hour. In fact, the Economic Policy Institute has estimated that if the minimum wage were increased to $12 per hour by 2020, more than 35 million workers would get a raise, including workers that earn between $12 and $13 an hour who would see their wages bumped up when the federal minimum wage is increased. Of the more than 9.7 million workers who are parents who would get a raise, nearly 1/3 are the sole providers for their families. Eliminating the tip minimum wage is also particularly important for women. In the 8 states that have only one minimum wage instead of a separate minimum wage for tip workers, women fare considerably better on 2 measures: the overall wage gap and poverty rates for tipped workers. The average poverty rate, for example, for women tipped workers in these states is 33% lower than in states that follow the federal standard. And for women working full-time year-round in these states, their wage gap is 14% smaller than the wage gap in states that follow the federal standard. Here, too, administrative actions can help more workers benefit from a higher minimum wage. Last year, President Obama issued an executive order raising the minimum wage for workers on federal contracts to $10.10 an hour, annually adjusted for inflation, and gradually phasing out the tip minimum wage. Recent regulations of the Department of Labor have extended minimum wage protections and overtime protections to home care workers, a group of workers who is overwhelmingly female and disproportionately women of color. Eliminating the pay gap and increasing the minimum wage would both increase women's cash income and reduce poverty, but still fall short of what women and their families need to achieve a basic level of economic security. A recent study estimated that two parents must each earn at least $16.79 an hour to provide economic stability in a family with two children. Ensuring this kind of economic security for women and their families requires a combination of higher cash wages, cash income supports, assistance to meet critical measures such as needs such as childcare, healthcare, and education, and measures to increase asset building and retirement security. I'm going to talk about just a couple of these. First, childcare and early learning. The primary source of funding for childcare assistance is the Federal Child Care and Development Block Grant, but federal assistance is also provided by the Child Independent Care Tax Credit, as well as some smaller programs. The Block Grant program provides federal funds to states to help low and moderate income families pay for care and to increase the quality and supply of care. States determine eligibility for the assistance within certain federal parameters and the amount of assistance that is provided to families, and they must match the federal funding with state funding. The Child Care and Development Block Grant Act of 2014 renews and strengthens the Child Care and Development Block Grant Program, which was established originally in 1990 and last reauthorized in 1996. The new law includes provisions to improve the health and safety of child care, to improve parents' access to child care assistance, and to improve the quality of child care for children, particularly infants and toddlers. It's one of the few success stories as far as congressional legislation goes in the last year, but it did not include the funding necessary to implement its provisions, let alone to meet the incredible need for child care assistance. President Obama's proposed fiscal year 2016 budget would significantly increase this funding. It provides sufficient funding to make child care assistance available to all children under age 4 in families with income below 200% of poverty, among other reforms. A second major piece of legislation that would improve child care and early education is the Strong Start for America's Children Act. It builds on a proposal by President Obama in his 2013 State of the Union address, and that has been included in his subsequent budget proposals. It would provide sufficient funding to make high-quality preschool available to all 4-year-old children in families with incomes at or below 200% of poverty. And it would also expand early learning opportunities for infants and toddlers and provide grants for high-quality childcare and education for children under age 4 through partnerships between early Head Start programs and childcare programs. Here, too, some states and cities are out ahead, and the popularity of preschool with the public is beyond dispute. A major sticking point, as it was for the de Blasio administration in New York City in the last few years, is the funding source, as a national program requires a large infusion of cash. The proposed Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit Enhancement Act would increase the federal Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit in several ways, including by making it more valuable for low and moderate income families. Currently, families are eligible for a tax credit of between 20 and 35% of their employment-related child care expenses, up to a maximum. Families at all income levels are eligible for this credit, but lower income families are entitled to a higher credit amount than higher income families. Unfortunately, however, lower income families are currently often not able to actually receive all or any of the credit's benefits because they don't have enough tax liability to offset with the credit, and the credit is not a refundable tax credit. Both the maximum expense amounts and the family incomes at which the credit percentages change were last updated in 2001 and are not indexed for inflation. As a result, the maximum value of the credit ranges from approximately $1,000 to $2,100, which is just a small proportion of what families annually pay for care. The Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit Enhancement Act would increase the maximum credit amount for families with one child under age 5 to $3,000, and for families with 2 or more children under age 5 to $6,000. It would also provide the maximum credit amount to many more low and moderate income families with children that are eligible for the maximum under current law. And it would index the credit for inflation and make it refundable so that low income families can fully benefit from it. If they don't have tax liability, they would get the amount of the credit as a refund. Greater assistance in paying for childcare is critical, but parents also need to be able to take leave from the workforce to give birth, to care for a new baby, or because of their own or a family illness. The proposed Healthy Families Act would guarantee workers the right to earn up to 7 paid sick days per year to recover from their own illness or care for a sick family member. The proposed Family and Medical Insurance Leave Act would create a national family and medical leave insurance program to provide paid leave for the reasons covered by the Family and Medical Leave Act. It would be funded by contributions from employers and employees and would provide partial wage replacement for up to 12 work weeks. Workers would be allowed to contribute and benefit regardless of their employer's size or the length of time on the job. Here, 2 states, in some cases, have paved the way by guaranteeing a minimum number of paid sick days and establishing temporary disability or other insurance programs that include coverage for pregnancy and childbirth. The District of Columbia, for example, is considering a proposal to provide almost every employee in the district with 16 weeks of family and medical leave at 100% of pay for those earning up to $52,000 a year, and lower percentages for those at higher incomes. Most of the reforms that I've discussed involve changes in legislation or other public policies, but the private sector has an important role to play as well. Increasingly, businesses and other private sector actors are recognizing the need to make full use of the talents and contributions of women. They're modifying their employment and other policies in ways that make it more likely for them to be able to do so. And this is happening even among employers of low-wage workers who have been changing their scheduling practices under pressure from many groups who have brought to light some of the inequities of these policies. Clearly, multiple efforts are needed to ensure the economic security of women and their families, and women's full equality. The need is great, but a women's economic agenda is achievable because the issues it addresses are central to the lives of women and their families. It's achievable because its components have the broad support of women and men. What is needed now is to turn that support into action and to make the agenda's promise a reality. This is our moment. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. People would like to be brave and ask questions.
Hi, my name is Claire, and I'm an MPA student here, and I'm very interested in immigration reform and its role in women's equality. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the work that the National Women's Law Center does or could potentially do for immigration reform.
Yeah, it's a very important subject. Of course, we have limited resources, and we have not been very actively involved in the immigration reform debate per se. But what we have done is to look at, in the areas in which we are working, how the policies that we are advancing or trying to advance affect immigrant women. For example, when Elizabeth was at the National Women's Law Center and we were looking at child support enforcement policies and trying to basically improve the enforcement of child support, we were very cognizant of the different ways in which that could play out for immigrant women, particularly undocumented workers who were afraid to come forward and get this child support they might be entitled to because of its implication for their immigration status. We also do an outreach campaign every year where we work with a lot of grassroots groups that particularly serve women child care providers and other groups to inform their constituencies about the tax credits, not only the child care tax credit that I talked about, but the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, and how they can help their families. And in the last year, we did a particular series of fact sheets about what the provisions, how these provisions affect immigrants, because in some instances they are or are not available to them. There may be special documentation that you have to present in order to do it. And people don't often know how to present that kind of documentation. So while we haven't had the resources to take on immigration reform or be part of that coalition, we sign on to a lot of the things that others are doing, and we try to look at immigrant women just as we do with other special populations of women, women of color, young women, older women, in sort of all the policies that we're looking at. So I commend you for working on it. Kate?
So my question is with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has made some comments in the last few years about Roe v. Wade, expressing criticism of the decision. I think that the rest of her criticism is that there was a consensus forming around women's reproductive rights, and that by the court intervening, it engendered this backlash. And so we never got a political consensus on that issue. I'm curious to hear if you think she's right, and how those sort of long-term considerations affect your decisions about strategy. How long is your time horizon when you're deciding what strategy to use, whether it's litigation, legislation, or products?
Well, our timeline's as long as it takes, unfortunately. It's interesting because in the early years after Roe v. Wade, Ruth Ginsburg wrote on this topic, and her complaint really was not the one that you are voicing, that it happened too soon before there was a political consensus, but rather that she didn't like the fact that it was based in privacy, and in the penumbra of rights in the Constitution that guarantee privacy, and she thought that it should have been based on sex discrimination and the Equal Protection Clause, and that would have been a stronger basis for the decision. So I think that in a certain sense, the comment that she made that you refer to has been a little bit magnified beyond, I think, what she intended by it. I mean, nobody can dispute in hindsight that if there had been, a huge popular consensus around something, it obviously makes it easier for the court to decide. But I think she would be the first to say that the court has a responsibility to interpret the Constitution with the cases that come to it, and that it probably would have been controversial whenever it happened. And even today, although a majority of people think that abortion should be legal and safe in almost all circumstances, there's still a big division in this country around that. So if we had been waiting since 1973 to get a decision like Roe v. Wade, I'm not sure that we would have been in better shape. I think we would have been in worse shape today if we didn't have that. But I think there's been a little bit of taking her comment to mean more than I think even she intended. Yes?
I think you touched on this a little bit, but some of the jobs that women are taking that are lower paid is partly because they want to spend time with their family, like maybe when they're quote-unquote mommy tracking themselves, and there's some of the highest paying jobs are inherently not family friendly. So I'm wondering how you address that, if part of that wage gap is partly because women are kind of opting out of these really high paying jobs in order to be with their families, if that's like a concern, if that's okay, if we shouldn't include that data because the women are choosing not to take that high-powering job, or should we make those high-powering jobs very family-friendly, or do things to make the highest-paying jobs more family?
Well, of course, I think we should try to make all these jobs more family-friendly, and that's pretty much the subject of Anne-Marie's book about the undervaluation of caregiving and how our country addresses it compared to countries all over the world that have more positive family policies. But the data, there's a lot of ways to slice and dice the pay gap data, obviously. But the basic 79 cents for every dollar is people working full-time year-round. So you can then look at what the part-time pay gaps are. You can look at what the gaps are in different occupations. They have the data by occupation. I mean, it was surprising to us when we looked at the data more closely that even in these low-wage jobs, under $10.10 an hour, that there's it's 85 cents for every dollar earned by men. So even there's a fairly large pay gap, even though this is a pretty compressed group of wage earners. So these gaps appear everywhere. And yes, of course, there are some. You're going to be paid less if you're working part-time, or if you've taken a job that is a lower-paying job because it isn't family-friendly. But I don't think that the evidence bears out that the lower-paying jobs are more family-friendly than the higher-paying jobs. I think it may bear out if you take part-time, you decide you only want part-time work, and then the only part-time work you can get is in a lower job. But low-wage jobs are less family-friendly typically than higher-wage jobs, but it's definitely important, to look at these data and why even across all these different occupations it persists. Sally, you want to comment on this? We have another expert here in the room. Yeah.
strategy around paid family leave,
Mhm.
and in particular, sort of how you get at maybe Democrats versus Republicans. I think in both cases, having to take on some of the small business groups pretty head on, whether it's NFIB or others, is challenging even for Democrats. And the Gillibrand bill, I think, has even struggled to get Democrats sometimes.
Right.
So kind of how you guys are going about that. And then on the other side, do you see any hope for doing anything without a Democratic House, or do you just have full bore of it?
Or a more Democratic Senate.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because on all of our issues, we typically want to get as much business support as we can. First of all, they're the strange bedfellows on a lot of these issues, and to the extent that you can get businesses speaking out on these issues, it's obviously significant, particularly when it's something that affects their workforce or where they think that it may have a salutary or a negative effect on their workforce. And there are now a number of sort of small business groups that are much more progressive than the NFIB, and so we've been successful in getting them to speak out on some of these issues. And I think here, too, we've got 3 states now, including New Jersey, that do have a paid leave insurance system that they're showing that this can work and that it isn't, doesn't break the budget either for the employer or the state. So I think that this is one area where the states really are a laboratory that can help keep the pressure on the federal government for paid leave. And the fact that you can do it through an insurance system so that you can amass essentially a pool of funds even if you just start in a job. It's much more difficult to have the funding for childcare, of course, which takes, first of all, larger amounts. It's for longer periods of time that you need it. And, unlike saving for retirement, which a worker can do at the beginning of her or his career and hopefully have enough by the time they get to be older to have saved and invested well enough to have a decent retirement. You can't really easily set up an insurance scheme for somebody who just graduated from college who might need childcare in 2 years or 3 years from then. So it's been much harder. On the latter question, no, of course I can't say that we have to wait until then. I mean, it's interesting that there was bipartisan support for this expansion of the Child Care and Development block grant program, and that it was very focused on improving the quality of care, not just the ability for people to gain access to subsidies for care. And in the time that I've been working on this issue, which started sort of right after President Nixon vetoed the first recent national child care bill, saying, it was a communist plot basically to put children in child care. I think there's been a greater recognition of the problem, and that's been driven very, very largely by demographics, by women coming into the workforce, and the need for greater child care. One of the interesting things we did several years ago was to look at the U.S. military's child care system, and we wrote a report on, it's called Be All That You Can Be, Lessons from the Military for Our Nation's Child Care System. And of course it's a closed system, it's the United States military, but the interesting thing there was to be able to show that the reason that the military expanded its child care system and has a system that again, still doesn't serve everybody in the military, but is in many ways a model for the rest of the nation. The interesting thing there was they didn't do it because of women. They did it because of men. They have an all-volunteer military. You can't just draft people and get them in and let them, worry about childcare and other things. They have to attract people now to the military, and they still overwhelmingly attract men more than women. And many of these men in this day and age have women who are wives who are work. And so they had to think about how, as an employer, they needed to address this problem. And so the more that we can get businesses talking about it, the more that we can get businesses that are successful either in helping their employees with childcare or in recognizing the greater public responsibility. I mean, look, in most of the developed countries in the world, it's part of their education system. It starts at birth and continues through. It's an entirely public system. We're the outlier on this.
So much for your talk and for coming. I'm trying to formulate my question. I guess one of the things that we've discussed in Martha Kubin's class on poverty and public policy is is that there are a lot of negative perceptions around poverty, especially around the undeserving poor, and that you can, with women working, you can kind of rely on maybe the sympathetic factor of presenting them as mothers, or they're working people. But I'm just curious to kind of hear, you've been talking about this economic agenda. How successful has that been as a strategy to present these topics instead of coming at it from this is a human right, parents need this, or
Fair
saying this is, maybe like Bernie Sanders, we should be like Denmark. So I'm just curious how this economic angle is working, especially with relation to poverty.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're very lucky to have Martha because she is incredible and has incredible experience in this area. But it's interesting because, of course, we always try whatever pressure point we think that we have. And for a long time, it was, well, if you present something as a children's issue, because everybody loves kids, how could you be against kids? So it was like, don't talk about childcare as a women's issue, and that was just helping women work and be selfish and go to work or something, but talk about it as a children's issue and how it helps brain development and all these other kinds of things. I think that one of the lessons that we've learned is that there's no one way to talk about these issues, and that certainly a lot of the history of poverty programs in this country, are filled with examples of how they were developed around very stereotypical ideas about the poor and about women in particular. I mean, in the old AFTC program, Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, generally, in order to be eligible for the program, you had to be a child that was deprived of parental support, which could mean that your parent was dead, your parent was disabled, or your parent had left, and then later in the later law that one of your parents was unemployed. But it wasn't until 1968 that the Supreme Court said that states that said to families that if you have a man in the house, if the woman in the house has a boyfriend, if he only comes around occasionally, then your child isn't deprived of parental support. That's what many states said. Now, if that had been a program that was essentially men with their children, do you think there would have been rules like that? So many of the rules that we sort of took for granted for a long time were based on stereotypical ideas about women and about the poor and about everything being the fault of the poor themselves, not the fault of the greater economy or of society. So I've kind of become more of I won't say an agnostic on these issues. I've kind of tried to be more of a realist on what do I think is going to work, and how do and to whom am I speaking when I'm trying to sell the policy. And one of the things, and so for a long time, we work on these individual issues, but it's the intersectionality of these issues that I'm trying to convey today, and particularly their impact on low-income families, that is important for people to see, and why they are related to each other. But look, I'm going to be politic about it too. I mean, there was a bill in Minnesota, that in the last year or so, where they did put together a women's agenda because they thought that was the way to sell it to their legislators and to their constituencies, and they were successful. New York City tried something similar, and in the end, they had to push out the reproductive rights part because of controversy around that, and people got upset about that, of course, that were backing it. So, to me, I'm making my arguments here to you about the way I like to make them, and a way I think is beginning to get some saliency. I mean, obviously we have a woman who's running for president, and she's talking about these issues, and she's talking about them as women's issues. And we have Bernie Sanders, who's talking about them not always as women's issues, but in other issues. And we have Republicans who have their own solutions to some of these problems. So I think that it isn't necessarily the best way to talk about them as a woman's issue, but I think that certainly in an academic community, we should try to understand what some of the stereotypes are that are at the basis of some of these problems, and also how, a country that we pride ourselves on. Look, the basic mantra of our country is equality. I mean, if there's only one thing that we stand for, if you had to pick only one thing, I think it would be equality. Some people might say capitalism, but I think it would be equality. And our entire history has been on expanding equality, not on contracting. And so understanding the basis, as you're doing in your class, for some of these policies, and how they were either based on the deserving poor or some other notions of who is entitled to it, I think is important in thinking about the solutions. But I'll try whatever I think can work, and I'll change it for whoever I'm trying to persuade.
It seemed like,
Here.
thank you for your talk.
Yeah, thanks.
And for your work. You mentioned a number of specific pieces of legislation, and I assume pending.
Yes.
Could you tell us who the champions in the House and Senate are?
Yeah, well, there are different people for the different pieces. There's a very active group of women in the House that Nancy Pelosi, as the minority leader, has been sort of a spearheader of it, and she's organized a number of women in the House who've taken responsibility for certain pieces of what they call a women's economic agenda. And so they might have a particular representative who's working on the retirement provisions, others who might be working on the pay provisions, and they've tried to put them together around the women's economic agenda. Now, to be quite frank, a lot of this is to appeal to the women who are voting, and to say that I care about your issues and you should care about me and you should vote for me as a result. So I'm not saying it doesn't have a political purpose, but I'll take that political purpose. Others, for example, the Family Insurance Act for paid leave is, as the gentleman back here said, has been spearheaded by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, but she has several co-sponsors on it, again, not Republicans particularly. And a lot of people are co-sponsors of the Paycheck Fairness Act, because if there's one issue that polls the highest among women across the country in every income category, in every racial or ethnic background, it's pay equity. It's equal pay. It's equal pay. And so many people are, have wanted to climb onto that one. But it varies. Sometimes because they're in committees that, where this is within their jurisdiction, and that's what you want to have. Obviously, you want to have people who you think have some ability to advance it, but there are all kinds of reasons why people come on these bills. And some of them, the Paycheck Fairness Act passed, I think it passed, it's been pending for years, several years. It passed the House, I think, twice when the House is in Democratic hands. It passed, it's gotten a majority in the Senate 4 times, but because of the filibuster rule where you have to have 60 votes, it hasn't been able to get 60 votes. So several of these bills have actually had votes, but with the difficulties in the Senate in getting 60 votes behind them, it's been harder. But they've been introduced. They're being reintroduced. We worked last year on the Schedules That Work Act, which is to try to address these scheduling problems. It's the first time anything to address that has been introduced in federal legislation. And it requires employers to give a certain amount of notice for changes in schedules, et cetera. It's a pretty modest bill, quite frankly. But interestingly enough, I think a lot of the change there that we've seen so far, especially in some of these big box and other employers, has been public pressure and the pressure of these worker groups that are really out there talking about how terrible this is and what it does to families. And so there's been a lot of sort of voluntary change in those policies that we have to encourage too.
I should have added, are there male advocates?
Oh yeah, oh definitely, yeah, definitely. I mean, Senator Sanders has been a very big advocate for Social Security reform and for not, he's campaigning on it, so you all know that. And in particularly on, obviously some issues have more than others. Some of the bills that are addressing sexual assault in the military, for example, and sexual assault on college campuses have bipartisan Republican and Democratic support. Because who could be for sexual assault? I mean, the bills, some of them aren't that great, frankly, and some of them are bad. But, they're out there. They want to be on the right side of that issue. But, having bipartisan support and moving it forward, and that's why really in the last few years we have been concentrating much more on federal administrative efforts that would address these things that can be done by a sympathetic administration. That's why I included some of them in my talk, because they can only go so far in some instances, but it's a way of trying to make progress in a time that's difficult to do in legislation.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you all.